A fateful afternoon. The late afternoon sun bathed Marie Carter's cozy home in a warm golden hue. Her small, pale yellow house sat nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with a neatly maintained garden that bloomed vibrantly in every corner. Gardening was her passion, a quiet ritual she had kept for decades. The lavender and marigolds lining the walkway weren't just plants. They were memories, each bloom a testament to her resilience and love for nurturing life. As she knelt by the flowered, her wrinkled hands carefully coaxed a young tulip from its pot into the earth. Her focus on the task was broken by the sound of loud voices. Marie looked up, squinting against the sunlight. A group of teenagers approached, their laughter and chatter piercing the calm. At the forefront was Jason Miller, a tall, wiry boy with an air of bravado that demanded attention. Flanking him were three others, each carrying the same rebellious energy that made Marie's chest tighten with unease. Jason noticed her gaze and smirked. Well, what do we have here?" he said, gesturing mockingly at her garden. Marie stood slowly, leaning on her cane for support. "Good afternoon," she said firmly, though her voice carried a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "Please stay on the sidewalk." Jason ignored her request and stepped onto her lawn, trampling over a cluster of daisies. "Relax, lady. It's just grass and flowers." One of the boys, a shorter teen with messy hair, chuckled nervously but followed Jason's lead. Another kicked at the garden border, sending a spray of soil into the air. Marie's heart sank as she stepped closer. "Enough of this," she snapped, her voice sharper now. "Go home before I call the authorities." Jason sneered and reached into his backpack, pulling out a can of spray paint. "Authorities, huh? Let's see what they think about some art." His words were drenched in mockery as he began spraying crude symbols on her pristine white picket fence. The others cheered him on, one of them picking up a decorative rock from the flowered and hurling it toward her window. The glass shattered into a cascade of jagged pieces, glittering ominously in the sunlight. Marie gasped, her hands trembling. "Stop this. Leave now." But Jason, emboldened by her fear, stepped closer. "What are you gonna do, Granny?" "Huh." He shoved her shoulder with just enough force to make her stumble. Marie's cane clattered to the ground as she lost her balance, falling hard onto the walkway. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. Pain shot through her hip, and she struggled to breathe through the shock. The boys, caught between fear and adrenaline, froze. But Jason laughed, masking his uncertainty with bravado. "Come on, let's go," he barked. They ran off, their footsteps fading into the distance, leaving Marie lying there amidst the destruction. A moment later, the sound of a car engine broke the silence. A familiar blue sedan slowed to a halt in front of the house. Captain Elijah Carter, her son, and the head of the city's police department, had been patrolling the area on his way home. He recognized the shattered window, the overturned planters, and then his mother. "Mom!" Elijah shouted, leaping from the car. He sprinted to her side, his heart pounding. Kneeling down, he gently touched her arm. "Are you okay? What happened?" Marie winced but managed a faint smile. "It's nothing, Elijah. Just some kids being kids." Elijah's jaw tightened as he looked around. The destruction was worse than he thought. Her once pristine garden was ravaged, the fence defaced with hateful slurs, and shards of glass littered the porch. His calm, professional demeanor wavered. "Nothing. Mom, you're hurt. You need a hospital." "No hospital," Marie said weakly, but her protest was cut off by a grimace of pain. Ignoring her objection, Elijah called for an ambulance, his voice urgent. "We're at 842 Juniper Lane. Elderly female with a potential hip injury. Immediate assistance required." Within minutes, paramedics arrived and carefully loaded Marie onto a stretcher. As they carried her to the ambulance, she reached for Elijah's hand. "Don't be too hard on them," she whispered. "They're just kids." Elijah's expression hardened, but he nodded. We'll talk about this later. Right now, focus on getting better. As the ambulance pulled away, Elijah turned back to the scene of the crime. His mother's home, a sanctuary she had cultivated with love, was in ruins. His jaw clenched, and he reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is Captain Carter. I need units in the vicinity of Juniper Lane. Be on the lookout for a group of teens, ages 14 to 16. They're suspects in an assault and vandalism case. The response came swiftly. Copy that, Captain. Units en route. Elijah got back into his car, determination etched across his face. The teens thought they had gotten away with it. What they didn't know was that their actions had set in motion a chain of events that would change all their lives forever. The reckoning begins. The streets of Juniper Lane were quiet as dusk fell, the warm glow of porch lights casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Captain Elijah Carter's patrol car rolled slowly through the neighborhood, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. The radio crackled occasionally, updates from officers responding to his alert filling the silence in the vehicle. His mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of what had happened. His mother, the gentlest soul he knew, had been shoved to the ground in her own yard, her sanctuary destroyed. Elijah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He was no stranger to crime, but this was personal, too personal. Just a few blocks away, Jason Miller and his crew huddled in an alley behind an abandoned warehouse. Jason, as always, was the center of attention, leaning against a graffiti-covered wall with feigned confidence. He exhaled dramatically, his spray can still in hand, shaking it occasionally as if it were a trophy. We showed her, didn't we? Jason smirked, his voice loud in the stillness of the evening. Liam, the youngest and quietest of the group, shuffled uncomfortably. His eyes darted to the ground as he muttered, "Maybe we went too far, Jason. She's just some old lady." Jason scoffed, pushing off the wall to loom over Liam. "Too far? It's not like we hurt her bad. She's probably fine. Besides, what's she gonna do? Call the cops. No one's gonna care about a bunch of flowers and a broken window." Liam opened his mouth to protest, but the distant sound of sirens made him freeze. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Relax," Jason said, his voice tight despite the bravado. "They're not looking for us. Let's just hang out here a while." But his confidence wavered when the unmistakable flash of police lights illuminated the alley entrance. A patrol car pulled up, blocking their only escape route. The door swung open, and Elijah Carter stepped out, his tall frame silhouetted against the headlights. "Evening, boys," Elijah said, his voice calm but charged with authority. "I think we need to have a little chat." Jason's smirk faltered. He glanced around, searching for another way out, but Elijah's imposing presence left no room for escape. The other boys stood frozen, their bravado evaporating under the weight of the moment. "Hands where I can see them," Elijah ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Slowly, reluctantly, the teens raised their hands. Backup arrived moments later, 2 more officers stepping out of their vehicles to assist. Jason finally found his voice. "What's your problem, man? We didn't do anything." Elijah's sharp gaze pinned him in place. "Didn't do anything," he repeated, his voice low and cutting. "My mother is in the hospital with a fractured hip because of you. Her home is in ruins, and you think you didn't do anything." Jason's defiance faltered for a split second before he tried to regain control. "It was just a prank, okay? We didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." "A prank?" Elijah's voice rose, anger flashing in his dark eyes. He stepped closer, towering over Jason, shoving an elderly woman to the ground, destroying her garden, smashing her window. "That's your idea of a prank?" Jason's bravado finally cracked. He took a step back, bumping into the wall behind him. The other boys stood silent, their faces pale. "Cuff them," Elijah ordered the officers. "Take them to the station." As the teens were escorted into the patrol cars, Jason's father, Tom Miller arrived on the scene. A burly man with a perpetual scowl, he stormed up to Elijah, his face red with anger. "What the hell is going on here?" Tom demanded, his voice booming. "You're arresting kids." "For what?" "Roughhousing." Elijah didn't flinch. "Your son and his friends vandalized my mother's property, assaulted her, and left her lying injured on the ground. That's not roughhousing, Mr. Miller. That's a crime." Tom's face darkened, but before he could retort, Elijah stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "And for the record, that elderly woman you're dismissing is my mother. Keep that in mind before you try to downplay what happened." Tom opened his mouth, but the words seemed to die in his throat. His eyes flickered with unease as he took a step back. "Your son will have his day in court," Elijah continued. "But for now, he's going to learn that actions have consequences." At the precinct, the interrogation room was cold and clinical, its stark fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows. Jason sat across from Elijah, his hands cuffed to the table. His earlier confidence had eroded entirely, replaced by a simmering resentment. "You think you're so tough," Jason muttered, avoiding Elijah's piercing gaze. "This is all just a big power trip for you." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Jason's. "You think this is about me? This is about my mother. The woman you shoved to the ground. The woman who spent decades building a home you destroyed in minutes. Do you even understand what you've done?" Jason looked away, his jaw tightening. "Let me tell you something," Elijah continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "My mother is the strongest person I know. She's lived through more than you could imagine, and she still chose to see the good in people. Even after what you did, she asked me not to be too hard on you. Can you believe that?" Jason's head snapped up, confusion flickering in his eyes. She said that?" "Yes," Elijah said firmly, "because she believes that people can change. But here's the thing, Jason, you have to want to change. And right now, all I see is a scared kid hiding behind excuses." Jason's face flushed with anger. "You don't know me." "You're right," Elijah said. "I don't. But I know my mother, and I know what she deserves. She deserves justice, and you're going to give it to her." Meanwhile, in another part of the precinct, the parents of the other boys gathered anxiously. Liam's mother, a petite woman with a kind face, was on the verge of tears. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Liam's never done anything like this before." Elijah's second-in-command, Officer Maria Vega, addressed the group. "What your kids did wasn't just a prank. It was cruel and reckless. But this isn't just about punishment. Captain Carter believes in accountability. And so do I. Your kids are going to face consequences, but they're also going to have a chance to make amends." The parents exchanged uneasy glances. Tom Miller, however, crossed his arms and scoffed. "This is ridiculous. Kids mess up. You don't ruin their lives over one mistake." Maria's eyes narrowed. "No one's trying to ruin their lives, Mr. Miller. But ignoring what they did won't help them either. This is their chance to learn, to grow. Whether they take it or not is up to them. And to you." As the meeting continued, the seeds of a plan began to take shape. A plan that would test the boys, their parents, and the entire community in ways they never expected. A path toward redemption. The early morning sun rose over the city, casting warm hues over the Carter home, which still bore the scars of the previous day's vandalism. Shattered glass sparkled in the flower beds, graffiti marred the once pristine white picket fence, and uprooted plants lay scattered like fallen soldiers in a battle. Despite the destruction, the home exuded an air of quiet resilience, much like its owner. Inside the hospital, but Elijah hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know if it'll work. Jason, especially. He's got this defiance about him. His father isn't helping either. Tom Miller's convinced this is all an overreaction." Marie reached out and placed a hand on Elijah's arm. "You're planting seeds, son. Not every seed will sprout, but that doesn't mean you stop planting." Elijah looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "You always see the good in people, Mom, even when they don't deserve it. It's not about what they deserve." As the day wore on, the boys began to work more earnestly. Slowly but surely, the fence was cleaned, the flower beds were replanted, and the shattered glass was swept away. By the time the sun began to set, the yard was starting to look like its old self again. Marie surveyed the progress with a nod of approval. "Good work, boys, but this is just the beginning." Jason glanced at her, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, crossing his face. He didn't say anything, but he picked up his scrub brush and went back to work. Seeds of reflection. The cleanup at Marie Carter's house continued for days. Each morning, the boys arrived under the watchful eyes of their parents and Captain Elijah Carter. By the third day, the yard was beginning to resemble its former beauty, but the work was far from done. Jason Miller, who had started with an air of defiance, now worked silently alongside Liam and the others. The heat of the summer sun and the relentless labor had stripped away much of his bravado. Though he rarely spoke, his actions began to carry more purpose. He scrubbed the fence harder, planted flowers with more care, and even corrected Liam's technique when he saw the younger boy struggling. Marie observed all this from her porch, her keen eyes missing nothing. Her gentle comments, delivered with a mix of encouragement and quiet wisdom, began to have an effect on the boys. Even Jason, the most resistant, seemed to pause and consider her words. "You know," Marie said one afternoon as she watched Jason clean the last of the graffiti, "this isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about understanding why you broke it in the first place." Jason didn't look up, but his scrubbing slowed. "It doesn't matter," he muttered. "I messed up. That's all there is to it." Marie tilted her head, studying him. "It matters more than you think. Understanding why you hurt someone is the first step to making sure you don't do it again." Jason stopped scrubbing, the tension in his shoulders betraying his inner conflict. After a long pause, he said, "I don't know why I did it. I was angry." "Angry about what?" Mary pressed gently. Jason hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Everything," he said finally. "My dad's always on my case. Nothing I do is ever good enough. And I guess I just wanted to feel like I was in control of something for once." Marie nodded slowly. "Anger can make us do terrible things when we let it control us. But you have a choice, Jason. You can keep letting it rule your life, or you can face it, understand it, and find a better way forward." Jason didn't respond, but his expression softened. He picked up the scrub brush and resumed his work, his movements more deliberate now. That evening, after the day's work was done, the boys gathered in a circle on the lawn at Marie's invitation. They were sweaty, tired, and covered in dirt, but there was a sense of camaraderie among them that hadn't existed before. Mary sat in her chair at the center of the circle, her cane resting across her lap. She looked at each of them in turn before speaking. "I want you boys to understand something," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "When you hurt me and destroyed my garden, it wasn't just about the physical damage. You hurt something much deeper, my sense of safety, my connection to this place that I've called home for decades. But here's the thing. I'm not interested in holding on to anger. I'd rather see you learn from this and grow into the men I know you can be." Liam raised his hand tentatively, his face red with embarrassment. "Mrs. Carter, I'm really sorry. I didn't think about any of that when we did it. I just went along with what Jason said." Jason glared at Liam, but Marie's raised hand stopped him from speaking. "Liam," she said, "it takes courage to admit you were wrong. Following someone else's lead doesn't excuse your actions, but recognizing your part in it is the first step toward making amends." She turned to the other boys, her gaze piercing. "What about the rest of you? Why did you join in?" One by one, the boys offered hesitant explanations. Fear of being left out, the thrill of doing something rebellious, the mistaken belief that it was all harmless fun. Jason remained silent, staring at the ground. "And what about you, Jason?" Marie asked softly. "Why did you leave them?" Jason's head snapped up, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and defiance. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't think about it. I just wanted to feel like I mattered." Marie nodded, her expression both kind and serious. "And do you feel like you matter now?" Jason's shoulders sagged. "No," he admitted. "I feel like a screw-up." Marie leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "You're not a screw-up, Jason. You're a young man who made a mistake. A serious one, yes, but a mistake doesn't define who you are. What defines you is what you choose to do next." Jason swallowed hard, blinking back tears. He nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. As the days turned into weeks, the boys began to take ownership of the project. They worked harder, faster, and with more care, transforming Marie's yard into something even more beautiful than it had been before. The hateful graffiti on the fence was replaced with colorful murals they painted themselves. Under Marie's guidance, the shattered flower beds were replanted with vibrant blooms that seemed to symbolize a fresh start. But the work wasn't just about fixing the physical damage. Elijah had arranged for the boys to attend weekly counseling sessions with a local therapist who specialized in youth development. These sessions were challenging at first. Jason, especially, was resistant to opening up. But over time, the boys began to confront the anger, insecurities, and pressures that had driven their actions. In one session, Jason finally broke down, admitting how much he resented his father's harsh criticism and how it had fueled his need to assert control. "He's always telling me I'm not good enough," Jason confessed, tears streaming down his face. "No matter what I do, it's never enough for him." The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel, nodded sympathetically. "That sounds incredibly difficult, Jason, but you have to remember, your worth isn't determined by what anyone else thinks of you. It's determined by the choices you make and the person you strive to be." Those words stayed with Jason. He carried them with him the next day when he returned to Marie's house and worked alongside the others to finish the final repairs. On the last day of the project, Marie invited the boys and their parents to a small gathering in her newly restored garden. The air was filled with the sweet scent of flowers, and the fence's vibrant murals added a splash of color to the scene. Marie stood before the group, her cane in one hand and a bouquet of freshly picked flowers in the other. "I want to thank each of you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not just for fixing my home, but for taking responsibility and showing me, and yourselves, that you're capable of so much more. This garden isn't just a reminder of what was broken. It's a testament to what can be rebuilt." The boys stood together, their faces a mix of pride and humility. Jason stepped forward, his voice steady but quiet. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter, for giving us a chance to make things right." Marie smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, Jason, for taking it. Growth and accountability." The sun shone brightly over the neighborhood as the final touches were made to Mary Carter's home. Her garden was more vibrant than ever, the colorful murals on the fence adding a unique charm to the yard. What once symbolized destruction now stood as a testament to restoration and growth. Jason Miller and the other boys had returned to Marie's garden early that morning to finish their work. This time, they weren't under the watchful eyes of their parents or Captain Carter. They came because they wanted to, because something inside them had shifted over the past few weeks. As they worked, laughter began to ripple through the group. Jason, who had once been the ringleader of their destructive spree, now took charge in a different way. He encouraged Liam when the younger boy struggled to plant a row of flowers and showed another boy how to properly mix paint for touch-ups on the mural. Marie watched from her porch, a soft smile playing on her lips. She could see the change in the boys, not just in their actions, but in their attitudes. They were no longer the angry, defiant teens who had trampled her garden. They were learning, growing, and taking pride in their work. Around midday, Elijah arrived, his uniform pristine as always. He leaned against the porch railing, nodding toward the boys. "They've come a long way," he said quietly. Marie nodded. "They're good kids, Elijah. They just needed someone to show them the way." Elijah folded his arms, his gaze fixed on Jason. "He's the one I wasn't sure about. He had the most to prove." Marie chuckled softly. "And he's proving it. Sometimes, the ones who push back the hardest are the ones who need help the most." Elijah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You've always had a way of seeing the good in people, Mom, even when they don't deserve it." Marie's smile widened. "That's because I believe everyone deserves a second chance, Elijah, even if they don't know it yet." That afternoon, Marie invited the boys to sit with her on the porch. She handed each of them a glass of lemonade and a plate of cookies, a small gesture of thanks for their hard work. They sat in a circle, the air heavy with an unspoken sense of accomplishment. Jason sipped his lemonade, his gaze fixed on the garden. "It looks better than before," he said finally. Marie nodded. "It does, and that's thanks to all of you. You took something that was broken and made it beautiful again." Liam looked up, his voice hesitant. "Mrs. Carter, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Liam," Marie said, her tone encouraging. "Why didn't you press charges?" he asked, his brow furrowed. We hurt you. We destroyed your garden. You had every right to send us to juvie." Marie took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the group. "Because I believe in forgiveness," she said simply. "Don't get me wrong. I was angry and hurt by what you did, but holding on to that anger wouldn't have made anything better. Instead, I chose to give you a chance to make amends, to learn and to grow. And I'm proud of what you've done." Jason looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I deserve it." Marie leaned forward, her eyes soft but firm. "Jason, forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about giving you the opportunity to be better. And you've taken that opportunity. That's what matters." The boys sat in silence for a moment, digesting her words. Then Jason spoke again, his voice steadier this time. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter, for everything." Marie smiled warmly. "You're welcome, Jason. Now what will you do with what you've learned?" In the following weeks, the boys continued their journey of accountability and growth. Elijah ensured they attended their counseling sessions and fulfilled their community service requirements, which included helping with neighborhood cleanups and assisting at the local community center. Jason, in particular, began to stand out. He took on more responsibilities at the community center, helping younger kids with after-school activities and even organizing a small fundraiser to buy supplies for the center. His father, Tom, initially skeptical of the program, started to see the change in his son. One evening, after Jason had returned home from the community center, Tom approached him in the kitchen. "Jason," he began, his voice gruff, "I saw what you did at the center today. That was good work." Jason looked up, surprised. "Thanks, Dad." Tom hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I haven't been the best at showing you that I'm proud of you. But I am. I just wanted you to know that." Jason's eyes widened, and for the first time in years, he saw a vulnerability in his father that he hadn't noticed before. "Thanks," he said again, this time with more sincerity. "That means a lot." The two stood in silence for a moment before Tom clapped a hand on Jason's shoulder. "Keep it up, son." As summer turned to fall, Marie's garden flourished, a living testament to resilience and growth. The boys continued to visit her occasionally, helping with small tasks and checking in to see how she was doing. Jason often stayed the longest, sitting on the porch and talking with Marie about his plans for the future. One afternoon, as they sat together, Jason turned to Marie, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Carter, do you think people can really change? Like for good?" Marie smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I do, Jason. But change isn't something that happens overnight. It's a choice you make every day to be better, to learn from your mistakes, and to keep moving forward. Jason nodded, her words sinking in. I want to keep changing, he said quietly. I want to make you proud. You already have, Marie said, her voice filled with warmth. And I know you'll keep doing it. As Jason walked home that evening, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. He realized that the lessons he had learned in Marie's garden extended far beyond its borders. They were lessons about accountability, compassion, and the power of second chances. At the community center's annual fall festival, Jason and the boys volunteered to run a booth showcasing their work in the neighborhood. Marie, sitting in a wheelchair with her cane by her side, watched with pride as the boys shared their story with the community. Elijah stood beside her, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. You were right, Mom, he said. They needed a chance, and they took it. Marie smiled, her eyes never leaving Jason and the others. Sometimes, all it takes is a little faith and a lot of hard work. Elijah chuckled. Well, they had plenty of that. Marie nodded, her heart swelling with pride. They did. And look at them now. The festival buzzed with energy as the boys laughed and connected with the community, their transformation evident to everyone who met them. Marie knew there was still work to be done, but in that moment, she felt a deep sense of hope for the boys, for the community, and for the future. Building bridges. As the fall festival continued, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. Families wandered through the booths, children laughed as they played games, and neighbors reconnected over warm cider and homemade treats. For Jason and the other boys, this was a day unlike any they had experienced before. The booth they ran was simple, posters and photos of the work they had done, the community projects they had joined, and the transformation of Marie's garden. But it told a powerful story. Did you really paint this fence? A young girl asked Liam, pointing at a photograph of the vibrant mural. Liam blushed, scratching the back of his neck. Yeah, it took a while to get it right. But Mrs. Carter helped us with the design. The girl's eyes widened. It's so pretty. I want to paint a fence someday. Liam chuckled. Maybe you can help us next time. Nearby, Jason stood talking to a group of parents who were curious about the program that had turned things around for him and the others. He explained how they had repaired the damage to Marie's home, attended counseling sessions, and completed community service projects. It wasn't easy, Jason admitted. At first, I thought it was just a punishment, but it ended up being more than that. It made me realize how my actions affect others, and how I can do better. One of the parents, a woman with kind eyes, smiled warmly. It sounds like you've learned a lot, Jason. That's something to be proud of. Jason nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. Thanks. I'm just glad Mrs. Carter gave us a chance. As the festival began to wind down, Marie sat with Elijah on a bench near the main stage, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Around them, the community buzzed with the energy of connection and renewal. Do you see them? Marie asked, nodding toward Jason and the other boys, who were now helping to clean up after the event. Elijah followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. I do. They're different now. They're finding their place, Marie said. It's not always easy, but it's worth the effort. Elijah leaned back on the bench, a rare moment of relaxation easing his usually tense posture. I wasn't sure this would work, he admitted, especially with Jason. He was so resistant at first, but you saw something in him that I didn't. Marie smiled knowingly. It's not about seeing something others don't. It's about being willing to look for it. Everyone has potential, Elijah. Sometimes, they just need someone to remind them of it. Elijah nodded, his respect for his mother deepening. You're a wise woman, Mom. Marie chuckled, patting his arm. And don't you forget it. Later that evening, as the festival wrapped up and the last booths were taken down, Jason approached Marie. He seemed hesitant, his usual bravado replaced by a quieter confidence. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for giving me a chance when you didn't have to." Marie looked up at him, her eyes warm and kind. "You've earned it, Jason. I'm proud of the work you've done." Jason shifted awkwardly, glancing at the ground. "I used to think people like you were, I don't know, too soft or something. But now I see that it takes a lot more strength to forgive someone than to stay mad at them." Marie nodded. "You're right, Jason. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's the only way we move forward." Jason looked up, his gaze steady. "I don't know what I want to do with my life yet, but I want to be someone you'd be proud of." Marie smiled, her voice steady and encouraging. "You're already on your way, Jason. Keep making the right choices, one day at a time." In the weeks that followed, Jason's transformation continued. He became more active in the community center, mentoring younger kids, and even organizing a project to restore another neglected garden in the neighborhood. His father, Tom, began attending counseling sessions as well, prompted by a heartfelt conversation with Jason about their strained relationship. One evening, as they worked together to build a small flower bed in their backyard, Jason turned to his father. "You know, Dad, I used to think you didn't care about anything I did unless it was wrong." Tom paused, his hands covered in dirt, and looked at his son. "I was hard on you, Jason. Too hard. Sometimes I thought I was teaching you to be strong, but I see now that I didn't always go about it the right way." Jason nodded, his voice quieter now. "I just wanted you to be proud of me." Tom's face softened, and he placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "I am proud of you, son. More than you know." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step toward healing, a bridge they were building together. Back at Marie's house, the garden continued to flourish, its vibrant colors a reminder of what could be rebuilt. Marie often found herself sitting on the porch, reflecting on the journey she had shared with the boys and the community. One afternoon, Liam stopped by with a small potted plant. "I thought your garden could use this," he said shyly, holding out the plant. Marie accepted it with a smile. "Thank you, Liam. It's beautiful." Liam hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to say thank you, too, for giving us a chance. I've been helping out at the community center more, and it feels good, like I'm doing something that matters." Marie's smile widened. "That's because you are, Liam. Keep it up." As Liam walked away, Marie felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The seeds she had planted, not just in her garden, but in the hearts of these boys, were beginning to grow. A new beginning. The crisp winter air carried the faint scent of pine as the neighborhood gathered for a small ceremony at Marie Carter's home. The community had come together to celebrate not just the restoration of her beloved garden, but the transformation of the boys who had caused its destruction. What had begun as an act of senseless vandalism had become a story of growth, accountability, and healing. The garden was breathtaking. Snow-dusted flowers stood resilient against the cold, and the murals on the fence now told a vibrant story of unity and hope. Jason, Liam, and the other boys had added their final touch, a small plaque at the base of the fence that read, "A garden rebuilt is stronger than ever, just like the people who nurture it." Marie stood near the center of the gathering, leaning lightly on her cane. She was dressed in her favorite blue coat, her warm smile lighting up her face. Beside her stood Elijah, his uniform as sharp as ever, his pride in both his mother and the community unmistakable. Jason was the first to step forward, a folded piece of paper trembling slightly in his hand. He cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Mrs. Carter, this is for you, from all of us." He unfolded the paper and began to read. "We started this journey thinking we were just cleaning up a mess. But what we learned is that fixing things on the outside doesn't mean much if you don't work on the inside too. You taught us that, Mrs. Carter. You taught us that people can change, not because they're forced to, but because they want to. And we wanted to change, for you, for ourselves, and for this community. Thank you for believing in us when we didn't believe in ourselves." The crowd erupted into applause as Jason handed the letter to Marie. She accepted it with tears in her eyes, clutching it to her chest. "Thank you, Jason," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion brimming in her. "You've all proven that change is possible when we choose it, and I couldn't be prouder." After the ceremony, the crowd mingled, sharing stories and hot cocoa. Marie sat on her porch, watching as the boys laughed and talked with their neighbors. They were no longer the outcasts who had vandalized her home. They were part of the community, contributors to something greater than themselves. Elijah joined her, his gaze following hers. "You did it, Mom," he said quietly. "You turned this into something more than I ever thought it could be." Marie smiled, reaching over to pat his hand. "We did it, Elijah. None of this would have happened without you holding them accountable." He chuckled softly. "I was skeptical, I'll admit, but you were right. They just needed a chance." As they sat together, a figure approached the porch. It was Tom Miller, Jason's father. He looked hesitant, his usual brash demeanor replaced by something softer. "Mrs. Carter," Tom began, clearing his throat, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done for Jason, for all the boys, really. I didn't think he'd change, but he has. And I know I need to do better too." Marie's smile widened. "It's never too late to change, Mr. Miller. Jason's taken the first step, and now it's your turn." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening as he fought back emotion. "I won't let him down. I promise." In the weeks that followed, the story of Marie's garden spread beyond the neighborhood. It became a symbol of resilience and forgiveness, inspiring other communities to adopt similar restorative justice programs. Jason and the boys were invited to speak at local schools, sharing their journey and encouraging other teens to think about the consequences of their actions. At one such event, Jason stood before a gymnasium full of students, his voice strong and confident. "I used to think strength meant never backing down, never admitting you were wrong. But real strength is being able to face what you've done and make it right. It's about taking responsibility and learning how to grow." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Jason didn't bask in it. He simply smiled and stepped off the stage, knowing that his actions meant more than any words he could say. Back at Marie's home, the garden continued to thrive, even as winter deepened. One snowy afternoon, Jason visited her alone. He carried a small wooden box, which he handed to her with a shy smile. "What's this?" Marie asked, opening the box to reveal packets of seeds neatly arranged inside. "They're for spring," Jason said. "I figured we could start planting together when it warms up." Marie's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "I'd like that very much, Jason." He sat with her on the porch, the two of them watching as the snow fell softly over the garden. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt a sense of peace. He knew he still had work to do, both on himself and in his community, but he was ready for it. "Mrs. Carter," Jason said after a long silence, "do you really think people can change for good?" Marie turned to him, her smile as warm as the summer sun. "I don't just think it, Jason. I know it." And as they sat together, watching the world slowly turn white, Jason realized that change wasn't about being perfect. It was about choosing to be better every single day. The bloom of renewal. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that seemed to breathe life back into the entire neighborhood. Marie's garden was no longer just hers. It had become a community effort, a symbol of resilience, healing, and shared purpose. Neighbors who had once been strangers now worked side by side to plant flowers, tend to the lawn, and ensure the garden flourished. The space that had once been the site of destruction was now a haven for connection and growth. Jason returned to the garden regularly, often bringing new flowers or small improvements to add to its charm. He wasn't alone. Liam and the others had taken on their roles as caretakers of the garden seriously, treating it as a way to give back to both Marie and the community. They weren't just boys fulfilling a debt. They were young men forging a path forward. One sunny afternoon, Jason arrived with a small wooden bench he had built himself. He carried it to the center of the garden and set it down carefully. Marie, watching from her porch, called out to him. "What's that you've got there, Jason?" she asked, her tone teasing but warm. Jason wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped back to admire his handiwork. "It's for you, Mrs. Carter. I figured you needed a place to sit when you're out here." Marie chuckled as she stood, leaning on her cane. She made her way to the bench and sat down, testing its sturdiness. "It's perfect," she said with a smile. "Thank you, Jason. You've outdone yourself." Jason hesitated, then sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when we started fixing this place, I didn't think it would mean anything. I thought it was just something we had to do. But now," he trailed off, looking around at the blooming flowers and the vibrant murals on the fence. "Now, it feels like home." Marie placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's because you've put your heart into it, Jason. This garden isn't just a place anymore. It's a reflection of everything you've worked to rebuild, not just for me, but for yourself." Jason nodded, his gaze steady. "I think I finally get it now. What you said about forgiveness and growth, it's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about creating something better." Marie's smile deepened. "You've come a long way, Jason, and I couldn't be prouder of you." That evening, the community gathered in the garden for a spring celebration. Strings of twinkling lights hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the flowers and murals. Tables were set up with food and drinks, and laughter filled the air as neighbors mingled and shared stories. Elijah stood near the edge of the garden, watching the scene unfold. He had seen a lot in his years as a police officer, but this was something special. The garden had become more than a place. It was a testament to the power of second chances and the strength of a community united by compassion and determination. Marie joined him, her steps slow but steady as she walked with her cane. "You look deep in thought, Elijah," she said, her eyes twinkling. He smiled, shaking his head. "Just thinking about how far we've come. None of this would have happened without you, Mom." Marie patted his arm. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. You held them accountable, Elijah. That was the foundation. And they did the hard work of change." As they spoke, Jason approached them, holding a small bouquet of freshly picked flowers. He handed it to Marie, his expression earnest. "For you, Mrs. Carter. Thank you for everything." Marie accepted the bouquet, her eyes misting over. "Thank you, Jason, for proving that change is possible." Elijah clapped Jason on the shoulder. "You've made us all proud." Jason smiled, the weight he had carried for so long finally lifting. "It's just the beginning." As the evening wore on, the celebration became a moment of reflection for everyone. The boys who had once caused harm were now recognized as contributors to the community's renewal. Their journey wasn't perfect. There were still challenges and lessons ahead, but they had taken the first, most important steps toward a better future. Mary sat on her new bench, watching as the garden filled with life and laughter. She thought about how much had changed since that fateful day, how pain and anger had been transformed into understanding and growth. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Marie closed her eyes, a sense of peace washing over her. The garden wasn't just a place anymore. It was a legacy, a living, breathing reminder that even in the face of destruction, something beautiful could grow. And so it did.